If you suffer from anxiety, you're not alone. Even celebrities like Oprah Winfrey have been public about their struggles with anxiety. You may be looking for natural alternatives and wondering if food can play a role in your moods, especially anxiety. Today I want to tell you about 3 foods that can definitely worsen anxiety symptoms and alternatives to those foods. First on our list is chocolate. I know, this isn't great news for those of you who love chocolate, myself included. I love chocolate, but fortunately, there are alternatives. So when we talk about chocolate, we're talking about cocoa powder, of course, chocolate bars, even healthy forms of chocolate like cacao and organic chocolate. It's wonderful and delicious, I know, but it does have caffeine and it can trigger mood swings. It can become addictive. You have a little bit one day and you want it every day, and it can just really wreak havoc with your adrenal glands, making your moods fluctuate, including anxiety. So a different option is carob. And if you've ever heard of this, this is actually something that does the opposite of chocolate, where chocolate kind of revs you up and gives you that little adrenaline boost. This is actually very calming, which is great for anyone who has anxiety. It's high in magnesium, and that's wonderful to include as part of a healthy diet that is also a calming type of diet. So I love carob. Now some of you may say that doesn't really taste like chocolate if you've ever had carob, and it's not exactly a chocolate taste, but it's pretty darn close. And you can always add a little bit of a grain coffee substitute in addition to the carob to get a more chocolatey flavor. So I'm talking about things like Pero or Dandy Blend. There's different brands out there of coffee substitutes that are in powder form, and you just add a little bit of that when you're using something like carob powder. If you're baking, making a chocolate cake, a carob cake instead of a chocolate cake, you can use that ground coffee substitute to give it a little bit more of a convincing chocolate flavor. And I want to say they also have carob bars out there and carob chips, so you can still make your favorite baked goods and just use the carob instead. The next food I want to talk about that can worsen anxiety is black tea and other caffeinated beverages like coffee. Those are going to give you that boost, again, kind of that initial boost of caffeine where you feel really good and you're kind of on that high and getting things done, but then it leaves you crashing later in the afternoon where you're reaching for a muffin. So if this is one of your favorite morning beverages that kind of gets you going, all is not lost. You can also have green tea or herbal teas. There are lots of great teas out there, things like rooibos tea that are actually high in antioxidants and that are going to give you great health benefits without that jolt of caffeine that's going to worsen anxiety. I especially recommend avoiding sodas that are caffeinated and things like Red Bull and those drinks, those like sports drinks that have like extra caffeine, because again, those are gonna rev you up but leave you crashing later and just worsen that cycle of feeling anxious and that your mind is racing with thoughts and things like that. So you wanna opt for teas like green tea. Has a little bit of caffeine, but it's gonna be less than coffee or black tea. And one of my favorite teas is Kukicha twig tea. Now, all of these teas we're talking about, black tea, green tea, and Kukicha tea, believe it or not, they're from the same plant. They're all from the same plant, but they're different parts of the plant and they're processed differently. This happens to be the twigs of the plant, and this is going to provide very little caffeine. So if you're used to caffeine and you still want a little bit, you're gonna get a tiny amount here, but it's really not much. They even give this to children, like it's very mild. So green tea is going to have also a little bit of caffeine, but not as much as black tea, so that's another option. And if you're looking to totally cut caffeine out, you can opt for things like peppermint tea. Peppermint tea is also very calming, which is nice. And then of course you're probably familiar with chamomile tea. This one also contains lavender, so it's going to be really calming. In fact, you don't want to drink this first thing in the morning or you're going to get sleepy. This is a perfect tea to have just before going to bed. You might even want to create a nice little evening ritual before bed if your anxiety gets in the way of you sleeping. For example, you can make a nice bath with Epsom salts, which is going to be a good source of the magnesium we talked about. And if you have a cup of tea like this chamomile lavender tea, that's going to be very soothing and help you to have a nice restful night. And a good night's sleep, of course, is going to help you to get ahead of anxiety as well. Now let's talk about sugar. Sugar is the third food that I do not recommend if you suffer from anxiety, because refined white sugar, even the organic kind, is just like the caffeine, is going to just kind of rev you up and give you that false high and then crash later. So you want to avoid that kind of spike to your blood sugar. Instead, I like to use things like brown rice syrup. It's a very mild, more complex sweetener, more complex type of carbohydrate. So it's going to be metabolized in your bloodstream a little more slowly and gently than things like white sugar. So adding this to tea is definitely an option. Now you'll find if you're used to things like honey, this is going to be a little bit more mild than honey. So you know, initially when I started using this instead of other sweeteners, I needed a lot more just to get that same level of sweetness. But then gradually your taste buds get used to it and you can use less and maybe not even sweeten your tea. But you can't go from 0 to 60. So if you're used to sweet things, you want to find a healthy substitute like this. Of course, you can use maple syrup as well. You just want to kind of just go easy with it. Don't use a lot of a natural sugar substitute because then you're kind of getting back to like almost it's the same difference if you're using white sugar. And then, of course, there are 0-calorie type of sweeteners. Now, I'm not talking about aspartame or anything artificial. I'm talking about things like monk fruit. This is pure monk fruit. It has none of the erythritol added. So it's going to be pricier, but this can last like a year. You really only need a pinch of it. It's a little fine powder. You can see right here. It's a fine powder. I got this on Amazon. I can always link below. But yeah, this really just lasts a long time. Sometimes if I'm making a cake for a special occasion or something, I might use a sweetener like coconut sugar or something, but then I won't use as much as the recipe calls for, and I'll add a pinch or two of this to the cake batter, and it makes it taste sweeter without adding more sweetener. And the great thing about monk fruit or things like stevia leaf powder, they don't affect your blood sugar, so even people who are diabetic can use these. So my other sweetener that I like to use is this stevia leaf powder. It's the whole leaf powder, so it's green. It's not, if you've ever seen those little stevia packets, you're gonna see that they're white. There too, they're kind of adding something else to it, whereas this is just pure, dried and ground stevia leaf powder. So I really like to go with the pure stuff, kind of a purist myself. So this is very nice. And again, you really only need like a pinch of this in a cup of tea, or if you're baking, you know, that's something you'll kind of have to figure out or use recipes that call for this. With baking, it's a little tricky. Like you can't substitute a cup of sugar with a cup of brown rice syrup, and you'd really have to know how much to use of this in place. So I'm going to show you a dessert recipe today that doesn't even use sweetener necessarily. Now, along the lines of substituting sugar, if you have a sweet tooth, if you particularly crave sweet things, because oftentimes people with anxiety will gravitate towards sweet things or alcohol or things that help them to relax. If you think of how you feel after eating a donut, how do you feel? Probably pretty relaxed. Well, we can achieve that other ways. I'm going to show you how to make a delicious, naturally sweetened dessert just using apples. This is something that you can also incorporate into your diet. Things like squash and sweet tasting vegetables. Now you might be thinking, squash is not a substitute for cake. Thank you very much. And I hear you, but you'll be surprised. The more you eat things like a creamy squash soup or even roasted carrots, even onions. I know that onions when they're raw have like a pungency, but when you cook them and you caramelize them, they actually become nice and sweet. And having things like that regularly in your diet is gonna help you crave sugar less, because then your body's getting the sugar that it craves in a more complex form. Of course, fruit is a great option too. If you're craving something sweet, rather than reaching for refined sugar and refined flour, you can always have things like, you know, cut up apple or pear or things like that, just raw fruit. But when you cook it, it becomes even sweeter. So that's what I want to show you today. So what I have here is one apple, and I just diced it up. I'm going to cook this, and it's going to become super sweet when I add a little pinch of salt. And then at the end, I'm going to add a little bit of a thickener to make almost like an apple pie filling. I'm going to use a starch, and this is called kuzu. Kuzu, you might have different brands around you. You probably have to go to a natural food market or maybe even an Asian market or something to find this. So you can always find these things on Amazon, but kuzu is a dried root starch, and it's very similar to cornstarch. So you just dilute it in cold water separate from whatever you're adding it to, just like you would with cornstarch. You've probably made gravies using cornstarch. Same idea with the kuzu. So I'll show you how to incorporate this with our apple and make a super yummy dessert that's gonna feel relaxing, you're gonna feel amazing, helps to really zap that anxiety, and it's nice and healthy. So what I have going here is I have a cup of water that's coming up to a boil, and I've got one of those chamomile lavender tea bags. I'm gonna infuse that in there and make a nice strong cup of chamomile tea, and then I'm gonna cook the apple in that tea. So while that's steeping for a few minutes, let's just run through the other ingredients that's going into this nice apple dessert. So I have the kuzu here. This is about a rounded teaspoon of the kuzu root starch, and I diluted that in a couple tablespoons of cold water. Now, if you think you won't be able to find this, you can also use cornstarch. You just need a little bit more. Probably instead of a rounded teaspoon, you'd need maybe a rounded tablespoon of cornstarch instead. I have a little pinch of sea salt that I'm going to add to this. That helps to just bring out more sweetness of the fruit. And we have that one diced apple in there. If you can't have apples for some reason, you can also use a different kind of fruit. You could use frozen cherries or blueberries or pears or something else. And I'm just going to have this kind of straight up without sweetener. But if you like, and it's not sweet enough for you, you can add a teaspoon, even up to like a tablespoon of brown rice syrup, or you can also use one of those other sweeteners we were talking about, like a pinch of stevia leaf powder, or a pinch of monk fruit, or even, a teaspoon or two of maple syrup. All right, so I think my tea is ready. I'm just gonna go ahead and squeeze every little bit out of that tea bag. You can always chill these, by the way, and then you can use it on under eye circles. It helps to, once it's cooled off, of course, when you chill it and put it under your eyes, it helps to reduce under eye circles. Just a little side tip there. So I'm going to put the heat back on our tea, and I'm going to add the apple. Then I'm going to add that little pinch of salt. If you like, you can add cinnamon, you can add other things here, but I'm just going to keep this basic and simple. So you'll just want to bring it up to a gentle boil and then turn down the heat to simmer it on low for about 10 minutes until the apple gets nice and soft. And I'm also going to cover it. Okay, it's been 10 minutes. Let's see what's going on with our cooking apple. This is perfect. You can see that the chamomile tea cooked down a little bit and the apple is nice and soft. You can easily break it with a spoon. We're just going to stir this around. If I was adding sweetener, if you want to add, again, a little touch of maple syrup or a touch of brown rice syrup, you would add it at this point. But I'm just going to go ahead and keep it simple and add the kuzu. And by the way, if you don't want to use the chamomile tea, yet another option is that you can just use water, or for more flavor, you can use apple juice. You want to stir this right away so that it doesn't get lumpy for you. And you'll see it thickens it pretty quickly. So it sort of becomes like a chunky applesauce. In fact, you could even mash this if you want to make it more of like an applesauce consistency. I kept the skins on, but if you want to take the skins off, that's okay too. We're going to turn the heat off so it doesn't thicken up too much more. So you can see this is nice and warm. I like to eat it while it's still warm personally, but otherwise you can let it cool down to room temperature or even serve it chilled. Just know that if you eat it warm, it's going to have even more of a relaxing effect. You want to get every last drop of this deliciousness. So here's our delicious dessert that's going to help to calm and soothe your nerves. I hope all of these tips helped you with your anxiety, and just know again that you're not alone, that there are many lifestyle changes like meditation and yoga and changes in your diet that can help a lot. Of course, I'm not suggesting that as a substitute for seeing a professional, but those are just extra things that you can do in your life to help. Here's to your health.